All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see all of you here for our panel in the midterm elections, Electile, Dysfunction. Electile. Dysfunction is part of our Uncomfortable Conversations series, which we developed last year to engage in meaningful civil discourse on timely and often sensitive issues that are shaping the national dialogue. My name is Jim Fisher, and I am the interim provost and vice president for academic affairs at Edinboro. And what I'm going to do is introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get going. So our panelists for tonight to talk about the 2018 midterm elections are Dr. Bridget Jeffery. Dr. Bridget Jeffery has served as an assistant professor of political science at Edinboro University since 1997. Her research has included an analysis of influences on President Nixon's federal judicial appointment strategy. Dr. Jeffery earned a PhD in political science from the University of Kansas and has taught many different courses across the political spectrum, such as law and society, judicial process and behavior, civil liberties, constitutional law, women in politics, and the American presidency. To her left, Jesry Friend advocates on behalf of more than 3,000 companies in his current governmental relations role at the Manufacturers and Business Association, Erie, Pennsylvania. Mr. Friend has served on the Pennsylvania Republican State Committee and is campaign manager for John Persinger during Erie's 2017 mayoral race. A U.S. Army veteran, he earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Edinboro University and a master's degree in public administration from Gannon University. To his left, Dr. R. James Wirtz is the chairman of Erie County's Democratic Party and associate dean of Edinboro's College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. He's a contributing editor at the Erie Reader and serves on a number of community boards and advisory committees. He earned concurrent bachelor's degrees in history and speech communications from Edinboro University, a master's degree in American politics and culture from American University, and a PhD in communications, media, and instructional technology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And our last panelist, Dr. Gerry Gentleman, is an associate professor of international politics at Edinboro University. He earned his bachelor's degree in journalism from California State University, Fullerton? Northridge, my apologies. Before receiving his master's and doctoral degrees at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Before joining the Edinboro faculty in 2002, Dr. Gentleman taught courses at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, College of the Holy Cross, and the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He maintains an active research agenda and is often sought by the media for comment on global affairs. So we'll start with our panelists offering opening remarks. After their opening remarks, they will have a chance to discuss each other's ideas and ask each other questions if they like. And then after that, we'll turn it over for questions and answers from our audience here in person and also our audience on Facebook. So without further ado, please welcome our panelists for Electile Dysfunction. Dr. Jeffery?
Here's some ideas that I had. So, one is to ask you, too, what you think about this later. But was it a blue wave or a blue trickle? Or my colleague over here has another name for it. But now some people have said it is a blue wave. And, you know, on the other hand, there's only a Democratic majority. There's a U.S. Senate with more Republican seats. And so, you know, how can you call it a whole wave? I don't know. But I'm going to get back to this when we go around again. But so Democrats won the majority in the U.S. House. And depending on where we are at which seats have actually gone through, there could be another 36 U.S. House seats given to Democrats, so that's a big deal. And on the other hand, the Republicans went from 51 to probably 53, because you might know there are a few Senate seats that we don't know about yet. So Democrats won more governorships and more state legislative seats, and so that's why one could call it part of a wave. Like I said, on the other side, they don't really call it a wave. They want to call it a trickle or something else. And so as far as the overall impact of the midterm elections, you could say it energized voters on both sides. Voter turnout was a lot higher this year. It might be because of President Trump. I would expect that that's part of it, and I'm waiting for other articles and analyses to really give us some idea of what polls have said about that. But I really hadn't thought about the independents. What do you say about people without a party ID? Or I see one guy out there who's a little bit more leaning to the Greens. I don't know what they would say. They're probably sick of all the polarization, so I don't know that it really energized them. And then as far as a path to 2020, you could probably make a good case or a good argument that it helped the Democrats, maybe because so many more issues were considered in at least the House races. Senate too, even for those who didn't win. And I've read some analyses that have said it really helped President Trump on his path to 2020. So there'll be more to say about those things. That's the kind of first idea. The second, why did the Democrats win a majority in the House? Now, one article has put it down to women and people who live in wealthy and suburban districts, and then also higher voter turnout. More Democrats actually did turn out, at least a higher percentage than usual, okay? Well, there are more women than men voters. You may not know that, but it's true. And then there were more women who ran and then who won. There are supposed to be more than 100 women in the U.S. House, and that's a real different thing. Thought I heard that it was 99 Democratic women and 19 Republican women if we look at the whole Congress, House and Senate, so that's something different. As far as the wealthy and suburban districts, those are the ones who seem to get more Democrats, let's say in the House elections at least, and somebody who looked at all the demographics saw that those were the ones with more people who had higher levels of education and higher income, so we have that. One thing that I didn't see written up, but I've heard about a little, there wasn't really a wave of younger voters, and as far as higher turnout among them, and higher turnout among non-white voters, so that's something to consider too. So that's the second thing. The third thing, what will and should the Democrats do with their newfound majority in the U.S. House? Well, they're probably going to do some investigations, I'm going to guess that. And so they do have the power of oversight, and a number of committees can look into a number of things that at least it is alleged that somebody or the other in the Trump administration might or might not have done. So that might happen. As far as impeachment, okay, some people are saying, no, let's not go there. And that would be I'm going to guess, the new Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, let's assume. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but anyway, if she gets to be the Speaker, she has been saying no. And Joe Biden, just for fun, he said no. And Adam Schiff, I think, said no. He's going to be the Intelligence Committee, House Intelligence Committee guy. On the other hand, Jerry Nadler, who's the going to be probably the committee chair for House Judiciary Committee, says, yes, that'd be a great idea. So who knows where that's going. But anyway, investigations, oversight. Legislative initiatives, there are many, and I shouldn't probably bring them all up here, but at least that's a possibility. But whatever the House Democrats bring up, it's got to go through the Senate, and it's got to be signed by President Trump. Chances are that ain't going to happen. So on the other hand, they want something to show the voters in 2020. Oh, we tried. Look, we put that all the way through the House, and it didn't get through the Senate, didn't go to the president. Oh, no. So that could still happen. I'll go back to the specifics later, hopefully. But what about the Pennsylvania races? I hope that Mr. Friend over here actually gets into that. But I'm going to say, so we got a return of our governor, a return of our U.S. Senator, Governor Tom Wolf, Senator Bob Casey. Mike Kelly was returned to office, our U.S. House member. I'm hoping Jezri can explain that. And then I kind of left it on Tuesday night when the decisions were made about those. On the other hand, for the House seats in the U.S. House seats from Pennsylvania, there had been 13 Republican and 5 Democratic House members, and now there's 9 and 9. So that's something. And you might have heard about, I would call it gerrymandering, you may not, redistricting. The state Supreme Court has changed the way that's happening, so it is allowed for different districts to be formed and, let's say, different geography for each of the districts, and so that helped the Democrats this time. Number 5, we still have some that we don't know about. Some races we don't know about. In Arizona, the Democrat is ahead, Kirsten Sinema, and last time I saw it was 32,000 votes or so. And then that may be the only one the Democrats take. So then there's Florida, and there's a gubernatorial race and there's a senatorial race. It looks like the Republicans are ahead, and Ron DeSantis as the governor versus Andrew Gillum. And then for the senatorial race, Rick Scott probably will be the next U.S. Senator, not Bill Nelson. And then we've got Georgia, where I forgot the first name of Kemp, but the former Secretary of State, at least Mr. Kemp, is ahead. And Stacey Abrams is not ahead, at least the last time I noticed, but there are lawsuits flying in at least Georgia and Florida, and so we'll know in the future. And so that's about all I have to say right now.
So I have answers to all of your questions. So ask those, if you're taking notes, she has some good questions, and I'm not going to answer them all now. We'll get through the panel, and then we'll bring them back around. But, you know, why did the Democrats win the House? There's a pretty good explanation for that. The short version of that, I could touch on that now. It's his history. It's not a blue wave. I largely believe the blue wave was a false narrative. It was pushed early on without any weight or any legs, and it was pushed hard as, obviously I have a slight bias, so forgive me, but to some degree a propaganda tactic to encourage, discourage, voter, whatever side you fall on there. And evidence of that is just a couple weeks before the elections came up, all of a sudden the national pundits started dialing back their rhetoric, making excuses. Maybe we're just not actually, you guys should actually go vote because this might not actually be as close as we thought it would be. Great example is the New York Times. The Sunday edition, right before the election, came out and said, hey, not going to be a blue wave. Everyone get off their couches and go vote. If you have early voting, please go today. And it was kind of a call. And so that was, I think, a big indicator to the, I'd say, the left side at large, who follows those kind of outlets, that this wasn't, in fact, a blue wave. It's kind of hard for someone to still, I mean, yes, obviously, the numbers are numbers and they have the House, but historically, the party of the president loses around 30 seats of the House. I predicted 26. I was a little bit off. We're at like 32, maybe 36 by the time we're done once things are confirmed. So not too, so plus a little bit more than 30. That's nothing more of a wave. I know early talks, they're talking about the 1994 midterm election with a little bit of referendum on Bill Clinton, and in that race, what was the, I think 54 seats. There's 2 more there. 54 seats. So you talk about blue wave here, a referendum on Bill Clinton's first term, there was 54 seats to us, and then in 2010, President Obama kind of took a shellacking with the 63. So you talk about wave, that might be more of a wave. It's kind of hard to call a blue wave when you have really largely one of the most notorious swing states in Florida. It's not called yet, but I'm going to go on a limb here and say get both the governor's race and the Senate race. So you have 2 statewide races, both going towards the GOP. So at the very least, even if they lost it, it's hard to kind of stick with blue wave in a close race. Now, I think with the exception of maybe Ohio, which is really interesting, where you have a Republican governor won soundly. Again, another race that has to be won come presidential 2020 races. But to their credit, Sherrod, the sitting U.S. Senator, also, to his credit, soundly won by several points. So here's a really interesting dynamic. We have 2 statewide races, and it's like a plus 19 going both ways on the voting disparity. So it's a blue wave, not so much. I think another telltale sign of the blue wave would be the newly elected governor of Missouri, Kim Reynolds. She was lieutenant governor. Her predecessor was named U.S. ambassador to China. Branstad, I think the guy's name was. So she was actually in there for about a year, but she actually became the first woman elected governor of Missouri, Republican governor. So, I mean, a Republican woman. Another one's Kim Young out in California, 45, outside of Orange County, if you guys are familiar with Los Angeles area. Again, that race has never even gone, or actually I might get that one wrong, that might be 45. 45 was Porter over Walters, but that was a race, well, since its inception in 1983, has never gone to a Republican. So when you have these races that are traditionally either borderline or have never gone to Democrats and are going to Republicans, large ones. I think that's telling. I think it's very telling that a lot of the progressive candidates that were a little bit more left of center than their usual moderate candidates, who really pushed as this new narrative that is the Democratic Party, the top 8 all lost. I think that's very telling. We can get to that a little more. I'll try to stay away from too much more of the national stuff. I had this big rundown of, kind of went on a rant today, type it out my notes. But on a local level, because I think that's what I'm here to talk to a little bit more specifically, ask me questions about everything you hear. But at a local level, I think it's interesting to telling. I can answer your question why Mike Kelly won. He got more votes.
Yeah, okay.
So
I heard that.
That's kind of, that usually works in your favor. But then a statewide where Trump won Pennsylvania by 1 point, it was kind of no surprise it would be quite an uphill battle for both the candidate Scott Wagner for governor and Lou Barletta for Senate, who was handpicked by President Trump to run for that race. By and large, if I can be objective, it was a very disappointing campaign on both their parts. There was a lot of missed opportunities for them to really, and kind of control, they didn't control the narrative, unfortunately. I mean, both of those candidates were so susceptible for a variety of reasons. Just for instance, Lou Barletta, there's a lot of things where Casey has kind of been, what some people kind of call just like a shelf candidate. Doesn't really have many policies he can hang his hat on. He can kind of go to, hey, I did this, I did that. He's kind of just been a rubber stamp, and there was a lot of room to call him out on. He started as a very centrist candidate, pro-life guy, really middle of the road, true to, I think, is classic Pennsylvania, but over time has gradually shifted to the left, kind of towed the party line. Barletta failed to call him out on that. There was a lot of room there. Another one with Wagner is, it's been no surprise, especially just some different things I've done career-wise. Governor Wolf has had some opposition with the business community. He's not been friendly to the business community. He's not been friendly to business taxes in the state of Pennsylvania, which government doesn't create jobs. When people say, oh, government should have more jobs, the only jobs they create is expanding the government, making it bigger, making the bureaucracy bigger, which, as a general conservative, I think less. I think I can control my life a little better, and I don't need the government or someone else to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. So as a rule of thumb, the expansion of the government is the only way government creates jobs. What the government can do is create an environment that is conducive to job growth, economic prosperity. And currently in Pennsylvania, we kind of had a lack of that with the exception of the federal reforms, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I've got a lot of data on that. We can dive into that in a little bit. Largely, my last point, I guess I'll say, and I'll move on, I think was a failure on some of the GOP, I can be objective, was to capitalize on their communication ability in that they focused on the numbers, the statistics, on why the economy's humming and these job rates. I mean, this is really great stuff, guys. Economy's great. Job rates, all-time records. By and large, by almost every measurable amount, but we are doing so much better than we have. However, they fail to communicate that and make it in dollar and cents. And see, most people vote very emotionally based, right? We're emotional creatures. We go on our feelings and what we think. And so there needs to be a way to demonstrate and say, here, have those poster childs of saying, here's company X, they live in Fairview. Because of the tax cuts, this is true. They bought, this $300,000 piece of equipment and hired 4 new people to run it. This happened. And bring it down to earth where people like me, 30, pushing 30, got 3 kids, child tax credit has doubled for that. That's pretty attractive for someone like me who's middle class and who has children. So for a candidate to run saying, I want to get rid of your tax cuts, which was almost the narrative, I think, across the line, the Republicans failed to capitalize in saying, I've never heard of candidates that actually want to run on getting rid of jobs. And they kind of failed to reach in the narrative. And Wagner was a big case of that, where he let Wolf completely handle the narrative, made him say he was a rough, gruff guy, and it showed, and failed to say, I don't need him to be my friend. I need him to fix these issues that's going on in the state that have wasteful spending, things of that nature. I've got some more details about the nitty-gritty of the races and some really interesting things I think that should be pointed out in like the O'Rourke case in Texas, the U.S. Senate race. Just the spending there, guys, was amazing. Almost $70 million raise. Quick thing on that, and I'll turn it over to Professor Wirtz here. The previous individual who ran for that seat in 2012 was a man named Paul Sadler. He raised $705,000. This was the U.S. Senate race in Texas, where Beto O'Rourke, one of those progressive candidates who was the poster child of this progressive movement went against Senator Ted Cruz, who maybe wasn't the they received. Sadler in 2012 received 3.1 million votes, where Beto O'Rourke received 3.4 million. It's a swing, it was actually about 3.2, so it was about a swing about 210,000 votes, which comes at a cost of $22, what was it, $20.29 per vote, or for vote O'Rourke actually paid. If you think about it by voters, he actually was cast in his favor, as opposed to Paul Sadler, who paid 22 cents. So you have money, all the money in the world, and sometimes it comes down to messaging. It comes down to this progressive message really isn't hitting the home of what is the electorate. I'm glad the turnout was high. We can talk about that a little more, and so I'm going to put a pin in it for now and let Dr. Wirtz go.
Well, I'll pick up right where you left off, Jezri, and say that progressives on the ticket in 2018 did struggle, and they didn't win, and that's because they are not the primary messengers of the Democratic Party, as you suggest. They are an important voice in the Democratic Party because I think they keep us grounded in some very strong foundations in the party that perhaps have slipped out of the hands of some Democrats over the course of the last 20 years. But electorally, we don't see progressive candidates doing all of that well, and that's because the majority of the American electorate is not yet in that progressive camp. There was a study out just a few weeks ago called Hidden Tribes, and it talked about the way that we as voters and as Americans kind of break down along electoral lines, and only 8% of the American electorate identified as true progressive, as hardcore progressive. The majority of Democrats fell much more in the center, as did the majority of Republicans. There was, or the majority of conservatives. There were only about 7% of the American electorate that identified themselves as absolutely conservative, very, very rigid conservatives. And so I think that narrative gets lost a bit, both in the media game and in the political game, when you have politicians trying to kind of battle toward extremes. Meanwhile, the rest of the country and many elected officials, most elected officials, I would argue, are much more centrist. I always like to say that you could go to Capitol Hill and find Republicans and Democrats playing basketball and baseball together, but when they get in front of a microphone or a camera, it's much harder for them to find common ground with which to work. So that's a problem for us nationally, but I don't think it's a political problem, and I don't think it's a signal that the Democratic Party has swung extreme to the left as much as it is that the Republican Party has swung a bit more to the right in that regard. I would also agree that it probably was not a blue wave, nor did the Democratic Party expect this to be or promote this as a blue wave. That was largely a media narrative, and I think that the message from inside the Democratic Party over the past couple of months has been that if you want a blue wave, you have to work for a blue wave, and you have to bring out a blue wave. And so the Democratic voter turnout that we saw on November 6th was much less about the so-called liberal media encouraging folks to come out and vote. And in fact, early voting seemed to benefit Republicans more than Democrats. I think it was much less about that and much more about the work that Democratic parties across this country and the Democratic National Party did to actually get out the vote. We can talk a bit. We'll talk a bit more about voter turnout and those numbers. And to Bridget's point, I don't know yet. I don't think any of us know yet what those numbers look like in terms of the youth vote, what youth turnout was. But locally, we can provide some insight into what minority turnout was and what the African American turnout and the New American turnout were, just by looking at precincts that are highly African American and highly New American, and voter turnout was extremely high in two precincts in the city of Erie that are historically majority African American and New American, where there are two precincts that vote in one place, and there are a total of about 2,500 voters at each precinct. Last year, in 2017, in the general election, there were only 70 voters at each precinct. In this election cycle, this midterm, we had over 750 at one of those precincts and over 650 at another. So I think we can, kind of anecdotally use that to talk about the incredible voter turnout that we saw this election cycle. I do think that there are a number of interesting takeaways from the national perspective, but I'll wait until we get into the group conversation to address that and talk much more now about the state and local elections that we had. I think that the success of Governor Wolf and the success of Senator Casey was much greater than just the failure of their opponents in controlling message or bringing policies to the table. Senator Casey, for example, is an incredibly popular candidate in Pennsylvania. And actually, I thought he would probably poll better than Governor Wolf did in Erie County, and was a little surprised to see Governor Wolf pull out ahead of him, because Senator Casey tends to be a bit more moderate and is a pro-life Democrat. And so he reaches kind of across that partisan gap a bit more than some other politicians do. And Senator Casey, who won his race by over 600,000 votes, won here in Erie County by over 18,000 votes, which was an incredible margin. Now, Governor Wolf, on the other hand, won the state of Pennsylvania by almost 1 million votes, and won Erie County by over 21,000 votes. An incredible margin of victory in a county the size of Erie, with the voter turnout that we had of just over 100,000 voters coming out on November 6th. So I think, we saw, as Jeffery said, we saw a record, the second highest midterm voter turnout that we've had in Erie County in 1994. It was 70%. This year it was about just under 54%. So we've still got a way to go in terms of motivating a base to get back to that 70%. But I think it was still coming off of a couple of years of kind of average to extremely low voter turnout. 54% is something that we can celebrate here in Erie County. Sure. And each of the Democratic candidates on the ballot in Erie County, even Ron DiNicola, and we'll talk about that race a bit more. He was our congressional candidate for the 16th district here in Western Pennsylvania. Even Ron DiNicola won his race in Erie County with historic margins, and so every one of the Democratic candidates on the ticket did succeed in that manner. And I think it's a testament to Erie County kind of returning a bit to historical voting patterns as we moved away from 2016. For those of you that have been around since 2016, you might remember that the narrative in the national media has been how Erie County turned red and was talked about as if Erie County was some kind of new Republican kind of stronghold or cornerstone in the state, when in fact President Trump won Erie County by less than 2,000 votes. It was 1,957 votes. So that in and of itself doesn't signal that Erie County has become conservative or more conservative than it naturally is. And I think that voter turnout this year and the way that voters voted when they cast their ballots, when they did turn out, demonstrates some of a return to that natural democratic pattern where we voted much closer to our voter registrations than we have in a few election cycles. And so I think just like we did after 1984, the last time that Erie County voted for a Republican president, I think we'll return back to that democratic cycle here in Erie County. I would like to address the Pennsylvania 16th District a little bit, because Ron DiNicola did win Erie County by 19,800 votes, which was a significant margin of victory here in Erie County, but he wasn't able to carry those nearly 20,000 votes into the 4 other counties that make up the 16th District, which are much more conservative, but not necessarily all that more Republican by voter registration. Sure. So it's a really interesting case. At the northern end of the Pennsylvania 16th District, we have Erie County, which has a Democratic voter registration advantage of just over 28,000 voters. In Butler County, which is the southern county in the Pennsylvania 16th district, there is about a Republican voter registration advantage of about 30,000 voters. And when the lines were redrawn, when the 16th was theoretically or supposedly ungerrymandered and redistricted, 7,000 Republicans and 4,000 Democrats were moved out of the 16th district. So it would seem that we've created a bit more of a balance. And in fact, when you look at total voter registrations throughout the district, there's about 199,000 registered Democrats in the district. There is about 202,000 registered Republicans in the 16th district, and about 60,000 registered independents. And I think that this race really came down to how those independents voted. And so we expected to lose Butler County to Mike Kelly. We expected to win Erie County. We expected to win Erie County big, and I would say that we won Erie County even bigger than we had anticipated. The hope was kind of 15 to 17,000 votes would be a really great night in Erie County, and it was nearly 20,000 votes. But when you look at Crawford County, Mercer County, and Lawrence County, and I think that was a big difference here, and particularly when you look at a county like Lawrence County, which has a Democratic voter registration of 2,000 plus voters, but has 6,000 independents. Here in Erie County, we expect the independents to lean a little bit more Democratic, and it was clear that most, if not all, of those independents in Lawrence County swung Republican, and gave Mike Kelly an incredible boost. And between Butler and Lawrence and Mercer, it was hard to hang on to that 20,000 point advantage leaving Erie County. So I think it bodes well for Erie County going forward. I challenge that narrative that Erie is red in some ways, and I think that we'll see the motivated voter interaction that we had in 2018 carry. Maybe not as strongly through 2019, but I expect voters to stay engaged in 2019 and to come back quite strong, particularly if there is a much more likable Democratic candidate in 2020 for the presidential election. And I think we'll learn a lot about not only Erie County but about Pennsylvania in the next 2 years.
More likable than whom? Good evening. The problem with going last is that they said a lot of the things that I wanted to say, so I'm left with some observations that I'm going to make. Is this okay distance? Yeah. I'm going to return the focus to the national because that's more of my focus, and I wanted to point out some of the people whom the Democrats are going to be sending to Washington in January. The Pennsylvania 6th elected Chrissy Houlihan, an industrial engineer, an Air Force veteran. The Illinois 6th elected Sean Caston, a biochemical engineer. In Virginia, they elected Elaine Lurie, a nuclear engineer and a former Navy commander, as well as Abigail Spanberger, a law enforcement official and a former CIA officer. South Carolina is sending Democrat Joe Cunningham, an ocean scientist. And New Jersey is sending a Navy pilot. In Michigan, they're sending Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA analyst and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. If these people are any indication, there will be sort of a change in the Democratic Party. There's a lot of people with military backgrounds, people who are scientists also. And so I'm going to make some predictions about what I think we can expect from the Democratic Party in the months ahead. They are younger. They are certainly pro-health care. I think this election was a lot about health care, about domestic issues in particular, not so much foreign issues, but I think health care is front and center. I think the environment is going to play a role. I think you'll see the House of Representatives oppose the Trump administration and some of its environmental actions, cutting regulations and so on. And I think the Democrats are going to try to style themselves as the party of patriotism with these people who have military service. I don't know that that's going to be successful, but I think that's certainly what they're going to try to do. I think you can expect them to be tough on Iran. Not that the House can do much about the sanctions at this point, but I think that they're going to support the president in desire. He already left the Iran nuclear deal, and I think that they will support that and probably move to be tougher on Iran. I think they're going to be skeptical about becoming too close to Russia. They'll probably put pressure on the president to not be so friendly to Vladimir Putin. And I think they'll be in favor of a greater U.S. security presence in the world. They will be in favor of being tougher on North Korea and not accept North Korea's word that it's disarming its nuclear program, that it's ending its nuclear program. Recent evidence suggests that they are definitely not doing that. And I think the House Democrats will take a tougher line on North Korea than the administration has. U.S. presence in Syria probably won't be affected by the Democratic takeover, or at least not even in the rhetoric of the Democrats, not that they can do much about it anyway. And it's hard to know about Israeli policy of the United States toward Israel. There's been a trend in the Democratic Party recently to become much more pro-Palestinian. We might see something of that nature among the Democrats as well. And the Democrats have, as I mentioned, they've elected a lot of scientists this time. And so I think you're going to see the House put pressure on the administration to respect the views of scientists when it comes to climate change and the environment. All that said, they are all still Democrats, so we can expect them to be sympathetic to migrants, both legal and illegal. They will probably seek to undo President Trump's recent order that made it more difficult for illegal migrants to get refugee status. They'll be in favor of keeping Obamacare. They'll be in favor of keeping regulations that the Trump administration has tried to eliminate on business and on banking in particular. And they probably will oppose tax cuts, further tax cuts, at least until 2020, when they'll probably start favoring tax cuts because everybody does during an election year. I want to make some general observations about who voted and who they voted for. Young people, we do have some, we don't know how many turned out, about a percentage of eligible voters, but we do know that young people overwhelmingly voted Democrat by 2-1. It's something like 66 to 33, something like that. Of those people who voted, 38% said they were voting to oppose Donald Trump. 26% said they were voting to support Donald Trump. And 33% said that Trump was not a factor. How does that figure into 2020? We'll have to see. Of those who approve of Trump, 88% voted Republican. Of those who disapprove of Trump, 90% voted Democrat. I don't think that's unexpected at all. For Democrats, this does seem to have been a referendum on Donald Trump. For Republicans, maybe it was about Trump, supporting Trump, maybe. But definitely it was about stopping the Democrats, or trying to, from taking control of Congress. That didn't work out for them. This was an election that definitely highlighted the gender gap, but Democrats did get 47% of the male vote. So this narrative that women vote Democrat and men vote Republican just isn't true. 47%, sure, 53% voted for the Republicans, but it's not exactly 2-1 or 3-1. Republicans, on the other hand, got 40% of the female vote, which I think is overwhelming. 60% of women voted for Democrats in this election. As far as identity politics are concerned, Democrats got 44% of the white vote. Obama in 2008 got 43% of the white vote, so that's about similar. But in 2012, Obama got only 39% of the white vote. So it's also false to say that white people vote Republican, they don't vote Democrat, because the Democrats did get 44% of the white vote. 90% of Republican voters were white. But the fact is that whites don't make up a large enough share of the electorate anymore to guarantee a win for the Republican Party, even though they're getting 90% of the white vote. As far as Latinos, Hispanics are concerned, 70% of them voted Democrat, but 30% voted Republican. So it is also not true to say that all Hispanics or all people who aren't white are voting Democrat. That's just not true. I disagree with my colleagues. I do think it was a blue wave. I think it was a small wave. And if I can make a dad joke here, I don't think the wave is big enough for the Democrats to surf into the White House in 2020. I think they're going to have to figure out how to make something of this little wave. I think what the Democrats ought to do is let Trump be Trump, not try to impeach him. I think that there will be a whole lot of investigations coming and a lot of things to investigate, not just the president himself, his tax returns, his Russia connections and so on, but people in his administration like Ryan Zinke, Betsy DeVos and so on. I just don't think that investigations alone will guarantee the Democrats a victory in 2020. I think what they have to do is let Trump be Trump and let that motivate the Democrats to come out in 2020 and vote the way it did in this past election. Finally, an observation about President Trump and his support for certain candidates. The president likes to say, or he has said in the last couple of days, that all the candidates he supported for won, that he campaigned for won, that he supported won, and that doesn't seem to be the case. There were several candidates that he actually went and supported and made a big play for who lost their election. Montana, the Montana candidate. Matt Rosendale lost to John Tester. In West Virginia, Patrick Morrissey lost to Joe Manchin. Even as West Virginia was supposed to be Trump's stronghold. Dean Heller of Nevada and Leah Vukmir in Wisconsin also lost, even though Trump campaigned heavily for them, as well as some candidates in the House. So, I think that the election really was a referendum on the president, and the referendum is mixed. You've got the Republicans strongly supporting the president, whether they like him or not. They certainly were supporting him instead of the Democrats, and you've got the Democrats who turned out because they can't stand Donald Trump. I think that's what it comes down to. Will that carry until 2020? I don't think so. I think the Democrats are going to have to find a positive message to run on as opposed to just anti-Trump. I think they're going to have a platform, something they stand for instead of something they stand against. And they're going to have to find a candidate who is just as exciting in 2020 as Barack Obama was in 2008. And to my mind, they haven't found that candidate yet. So, thank you for listening.
Can we get a quick round of applause for right now, we are going to, before we turn it over to questions, we have some audience questions and some social media questions. We're going to give each of our panelists 2 minutes max to kind of comment. I know I see the grimaces on their faces. As you probably can guess, we can do an entire semester-long course on just this midterm. So we're going to give each panelist about 2 minutes to respond, and then we're going to do a mix of the audience questions. So if you have questions, I'm going to come around with a microphone. If you'd rather have me read them, you can jot them down, whatever's easiest for you. So we'll turn it over to our panelists, and then we will open it up to questions. We'll start and go right down.
I have to say, I don't know what else to say. I kind of agree with all of you. You have some really good points that I wasn't thinking about because I'm not a Republican. But, well, Dr. Gentleman made a good point at the end. Boy, the Democrats need an exciting candidate in 2020 if they expect to take the presidency, and somebody who knocks the socks off of people as much as Barack Obama did. And that's one thing. If you ever did read about the midterms, nobody seems to see that person, right now at least. So I don't know how that's going to go. Oops.
Yep, go for it, Jim.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that I think Gerry, Dr. Gentleman is part correct. That Democrats were perhaps motivated to get out because they're unhappy about the Trump presidency, but I don't think that was a defining issue, so to speak. I mean, when you travel around and talk to voters, they all had an issue that they were voting on, and for most of them, it was health care. And I think one thing that we saw here, Jeffery, earlier you mentioned that many voters are emotional voters, and they are indeed, and I would agree with that 100%. But I think more this year than we've seen in a few cycles were voters who were really invested in in issues that affected them. They became kind of interest voters for those that were most closely aligned with their personal interests, and kind of going up and down the 16th district and learning more about the southern counties in the 16th district. I was surprised how many voters that I talked to, folks that were definitely Trump people in 2016 who were supporting Ron DeNicola this year, and the number one issue for them was health care and protections for pre-existing conditions, because they knew someone who had a pre-existing condition, they themselves had been affected by a pre-existing condition, and they knew what that cost would be if that protection was ever taken away. And so I think people thought much more deeply about issues in this midterm than maybe they have, and not to kind of discredit them in previous election cycles, but I feel like we've been very emotional since 2008, and I think that this year they started to think more about how federal policy affects them, and I think that's a positive trend, and we should embrace that and talk issues to our electorate.
I just want to disagree with something that Dr. Fisher said early on. I meant to correct this earlier. Just for the record, since this is all for the record, I did not teach at MIT. I did research in the Center for International Studies. I just want to get that out there. But one of the things that I did research on was the decline of Russian infrastructure and the effects of the decline of Russian infrastructure on society. And with the Democrats taking over the House, I think there's actually room for some cooperation between Congress and the President. The President has said a very unconservative thing, because he's not conservative, which is that he wants to spend billions of dollars restoring American infrastructure, and that's something I think Democrats would agree on. So I think there is some room for cooperation there.
So I got a lot of points. I'm going to try and keep to your 2-minute rule. So I'm going to high level them, but what Dr. Gentleman just said was my 2 points. I said, here's my unsolicited free advice to the Democratic Party as a whole, if you're watching out there. The top 2 things I think, and to answer Dr. Jeffrey's question earlier, is what do the Democrats do now? They have the House. What do you do? Largely, I think, to what seems to be the consensus here is it's going to be investigations, it's going to be crazy. But if it would behoove them not to do that, I think if they do that, we're going to find out at the end that, well, Trump makes a lot of money. He might make a little bit less than he let on, but go figure. The guy exaggerates things. I mean, who's going to be surprised by that? And then the other thing is, at the end of these investigations, what are they going to have to show for it? What's going to happen is they're going to largely be seen as not having policy that they're running on, and it's still going to continue this anti-Trump and maybe to a lesser extent anti-Republican narrative. That doesn't go well. I think where there is signs for, not only for the Democrats, but I think for a cross-party thing is infrastructure and immigration, the 2 I's. I think those are 2 things. Trump ran on it early on. I think that's something that both people, it's not an ideological issue. Immigration a little bit now, but it didn't used to be so much. But infrastructure, that's an easy one. That's something that, 2 years, the 2 can get together, combine their heads on it. Both sides can put their hat to it and say, hey, we worked on this. We did bipartisan support, whatever you want. I think that could be a win for the U.S. at large in the next year. So all the negative and the identity politics and the party lines to, I heard someone, one pundit say that it wasn't as much a vote as turnout as it was much of a vote for, we found out how many R's and how many D's live in each district. Maybe. So I think that's something where there's going to be some cross support. So I hit what the Democrats should do. New Speaker of the House. That's going to be a question that's going to come up. Nancy Pelosi, I think it should be noted that around 50 Democrat candidates running for office all campaigned on the premise, Ron DeNicola was one of them, I will not support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House.
But a lot of those lost.
Some of those did lose. But I think it'd be interesting to see those who won. Will they stick to their promise, or week 1 they come in, they're already lying their constituency? I don't know.
I think they're going to go after Steny Hoyer is what I think.
I think Tim Ryan could be viable out of Ohio. He's kind of thrown his name around there. Even though I think at the end of the day I say she's going to get it. She'll get it.
I think so.
But I'd like to see someone challenge the establishment. I think it'd be good for the Democratic Party for them to establish. There's a lot of young, newly elected Democrats coming up who are sick of kind of the people who's been in there for, longer than I've been alive.
But the one thing you have to remember is that among all the veterans that Dr. Gentleman mentioned are also a lot of Washington veterans as well, and folks who held positions inside either the Obama White House or the Bill Clinton administration. And so those folks are not coming in thinking about a change in leadership in the House. I would guess. I would think that they tend to be a little bit more conservative within the party and a little bit more status quo. So I think the challenge to House leadership is going to be a difficult one. I think it's a conversation that Democrats should have and a fight worth having in Washington. And I like some of your picks, Jezreel, I have to say. So.
Yeah, I'm pretty objective. I think I'll hit the Mike Kelly race real quick because that's kind of what we've been on and we've focused a long time on that. I think it's interesting. Dr. Wirtz is right on with his numbers, but I'm also not as surprised by the numbers as I think you are. The fact that, like, wow, it's this big surprise that Ron DeNicola took 19,000 votes in Erie County, where surprise, surprise, the Democrats have a 28,000 vote registration advantage. So I think I'm more interested, why did the Democrats do better in Erie County, that they had that much of a loss? That's an interesting question, maybe that I don't have the answer to, but as to me is not as much of a surprise. Looking at the numbers, here's something interesting, and I agree with you, independents are such a large factor in hotly contested races, in flip, we'll say competitive ones, but not even just going after independents as a whole, it's the low turnout independents is who you have to go after. The high turnout independents are going to turn out, and they likely already had the candidate they like, they just don't want to commit to a party. But the low turnout independents are those ones that are truly on the fence. So consider these, I think the most thing that people were not considering were the independent generic ballots, okay? Now consider this. The exact last time in a midterm election that the president, let's say the Republican Party, had control of the presidency and the House was in 2006 midterm election. Given that exact same political climate, we'll say, the unemployment rate was at 4.4%, and 2 weeks before the election was at 3.7. Presidential approval was at 38%, 2 weeks before the election, 47. It's a 9-point swing. And most significant, there's a couple other things, but most significantly, the independent generic ballot had Democrats at plus 19% in 2006, plus 19. 2 weeks ago, plus 4. That's a 15-point swing amongst the independents. And those are the people you must have if you're going to win in a hotly contested race. If it's kind of already neck and neck, the polling was a little bit all over the place. We saw the Susquehanna poll that came out a couple days before. It said, oh, Ron DeNicola's up by 3, maybe 5. We found that to be largely flawed. And Mike won by 4 and some change, I think it was, which was pretty consistent, a little bit off with the general, about 5 to 7 that he was up throughout. So the polling kind of actually, in that sense, remained accurate. But to your question was, how did Mike Kelly win, was those independents. They largely weren't going for it. You kind of, Dr. Wirtz, I think you implied that it's not the narrative of the Democratic Party for this largely progressive thing. And from a party perspective, that may be true. From the general public perspective, that's lost on them, from my experience. And then I do want to point out that Erie, the comment about Erie County never was a red county. Yeah, that's stupid, razor thin, less than 2,000 votes. It's quite a stretch to make that happen as a county whole again, but I do think it should be noted that the Democratic Party of Erie, maybe even specifically the city, maybe to a lesser extent the county, is not the same as the Democratic Party in San Francisco, okay? That is maybe a little bit more, quite a bit more to the left, where the Democratic Party in Erie County is quite a bit to the center. I personally door knocked on some 9,000 votes during the Persinger for mayor campaign. I saw Dr. Fisher once out there at a park. Talked to him for a little bit. I don't know if I was able to convince you or not. Here nor there, we lost by 5 points. But I think it was significant where you had a candidate like John Persinger who started out with a 50-point underdog, right? 50-point underdog. That is insane and almost, you'd think, a waste of my time to do that, to come within 5 points. I mean, that'd be nothing short of a miracle. And if I did that, I would have been writing a book and who knows, maybe made more money somewhere.
Thank you for your real quick response, but I think we're going to go to questions.
Okay. Hit me with more questions.
I'm going to read a book up there. All right, I think the first question from social media is more implications for the 2020 election. A Facebook question was anything to do with Hillary's connections and the Soros, which I believe is to do with the campaign finance contributions. So if you talk about, if Hillary has any... If Hillary has any impact, her connections have any impact on the candidates, or if there's anything with the Soros.
In 2018?
I think it's more toward the 2020 election.
I don't think we can speak about the influence of anybody in 2020 just yet. Donald Trump's the only one we know that's going to probably show up in 2020 right now. So I think we'll hold off on that one for now.
But I would say that I think it would be a terrible mistake if the Democratic Party nominated Hillary Clinton or if she moved in that direction. I mean, she got more popular votes than Donald Trump. She was a very inspiring candidate for a lot of people, but I think it's time to move on to a different candidate for that party.
Politico had a story today that an advisor to Hillary said she's not ruling it out yet, so for all you Democrats, Hillary 2020.
Yeah, I think Republicans should be encouraging it.
We actually have our first hashtag for Genlin 2020 on Facebook. Let's open it up to the audience. Is there anybody that has questions? Go.
Thank you. So we saw a lot more diverse group of people be elected this election, as far as LGBTQ women, and even we had 2 Native American women win. Do you think this is going to be a permanent trend in elections in the future? Do you think this was more of a response to some of Trump rhetoric?
Just real quickly, I think that plays into the Democratic Party's strength, which is identity politics. As a percentage of the House Democratic caucus that's coming up, white men make up 38% of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. House Republicans, white men will make up 90%. And I think that plays to the Democrats' strength.
I've said for a while that we learned an important lesson both in 2008 and 2012 nationally, and that's that Barack Obama, this incredibly popular Democrat, did not win a majority of white voters in either election cycle. And that tells us 2 things, that the Democratic Party as a whole is much more diverse than that, and that we have a very powerful plurality of voters that are comprised of women and various ethnic groups. I hesitate to call them minority voters anymore because it is this powerful plurality that plays such an important role will play an important role in every election going forward.
Sure. I'm going to try to make this a question, I guess. Full disclosure, I'm a Democrat and all that. But I've noticed something that the Republican Party seems to do so much better than our party is come together as a base. And I know we talk a lot about the young voters and the progressive movement, and no, a lot of progressives didn't win in this. But most of the young voters that I know that think the way I do, they say they don't want to go out and vote because they're not seeing the party push for progressive candidates. So I guess my question is, how do we as a party come together and actually come to more of a middle in the left than, in the center of the whole thing?
That's probably a you question.
Yeah. I think you don't see the party broadly stumping in favor of progressive candidates because nationally the party is not broadly progressive. I do think it's important to have those progressive candidates and those progressive voices in the party to kind of keep the Democratic Party as a whole honest. I often hear from young voters, we don't vote because there aren't candidates that look like us. And you hear the same thing from African American and other groups. Like, we don't vote because the candidates don't look like us, but the candidates also don't look like you because you're not out there voting. And if you want significant candidates that can perform for you electorally, you have to show up and vote when there aren't candidates that look like you, and when there aren't candidates that carry the totality of your progressive message. I would challenge any progressive, any true progressive, to show me a Republican who's going to perform better for them than a Democrat. And so to stay at home or to not vote because the candidate because you think the Democrat doesn't represent you as much, I think is a bit of a misnomer. And so you have to build that political capital and that social capital by going and casting that ballot and ensuring that your voice and your issues do become part of the platform.
What could the media have done better for the midterm election, and is there anything that it did wrong?
Go ahead.
No. You're part of the media, aren't you?
Go ahead, Jess. I guess I'll say my thoughts. I don't know if you did wrong. I'd really like to see a focus on policy and what's working, what hasn't been working. I think there's been a lot of miscommunication out there. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was one. That's, I guess, a concrete answer for you. What the media did wrong was they didn't objectively look at it. They didn't actually talk to the people who are business owners who did this. So in my job professionally, I work for a manufacturing business association of over 3,000 members across the state on a daily. I talk to the CEOs, the presidents, what's working, what's not working, and specifically I'm government affairs, so I'm kind of a liaison between elected officials. I go down to Harrisburg, occasionally DC. And what's interesting is maybe some of the representatives aren't talking to their constituencies. The media surely isn't. What they could have been doing better was talking to them and finding out that these companies actually are giving raises to people. I'll give you a concrete example of a company in Lake City. I won't say their name. They were a first shift company, had about 20-some employees, but because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the downline stuff where their orders increased so much, they hired on so many people, they put on a whole second shift. People that were on first shift got promoted to supervisor roles. So for people like that, they're saying, oh, the tax cuts are only for this, the boogeyman of the wealthy 1% that are out to get you. How about those people who just got a job that paid $22 an hour and did not have a job? They're liking it. And there's a lot of things like that. We're having a big seminar we're putting on in January for all these companies that are coming to us and saying, what do we do to retain to get new talent because we have such a demand for it, and to retain it? And a lot of these are it's all coming back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so they've been great. So what could the media have done better is done a little bit more investigative journalism and shown up facts instead of this fear-mongering, just kind of blanket numbers without any, I didn't see much validity behind them.
Well, you could say that the media, at least the way we see it, is polarized.
Sure.
So if you only think of, Fox and MSNBC, and of course now CNN, no longer in the middle, apparently, more like a MSNBC, a lot of people would say, and at least a lot of people seem to think that they are taking either Fox, a conservative view, and leaving out anything good about the liberals and centrists and so forth. And the other side is doing the opposite. So where do you go? Where does a regular person who doesn't feel like he or she is a true liberal or conservative, where does that person go for news? The professors will tell you to read the New York Times and the Washington Post, and then students will come back and say, well, but wait a minute, they're way too liberal. So
I think the traditional media still does a pretty good job. When I say traditional, I mean the print sources and some of the major television, not necessarily the 24-hour stations, but some of the news stations, particularly those that are based in Washington, do a pretty decent job of covering the issues. I think it becomes harder because the message, particularly the message that most of us consume in both cable and online media, gets distorted in part because of their own measure, but in part because of the non-news that's happening as well, the InfoWars and the manufactured stories. And so it becomes harder and harder for them to concentrate on the work that the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing. You'll notice I include the Wall Street Journal in there. I think some of the most moderate positions and some of the most objective news that we saw in this last cycle and really over the last 2 years has actually come out of the Wall Street Journal. And so that's a great sign, I think, for that publication, and it's a good sign for journalism in general that there are still organizations willing to practice that. I think the real erosion of media influence is happening at the local level, where we have fewer and fewer locally owned media sources that are becoming subject to less and less fewer and fewer publication schedules.
With this new House and Senate, do you see any avenue where a deal on DACA could be made?
I don't want to answer that question. I haven't had enough time to think about it. I guess my gut reaction is yes, I do. I think the Democrats are strongly in favor of preserving it. I think a court just ruled that the president can't unilaterally get rid of it, and so I think there may not need to be a deal made. But I do think that the president is a lot more open-minded on that issue than the rest of the Republican Party is, and I think that that there is a room for a deal there. Yeah, absolutely.
Next audience question. You have any?
In the back.
He does not need a microphone.
Thank you. Very, very informative. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are with regard to policy initiatives by the Democrats that are going to run up against Republican obstructionism, which they have always managed to do when they're in the minority in the House, and certainly in the Senate, they still control the executive. So certainly, you know, that's going to happen. What's the possibility for any real new legislation in healthcare, education, and immigration, given the two components?
For the viewers watching from Facebook and Twitter, the question was about the Democratic candidates and a lot of the policy dealing with healthcare and education. What happens when they encounter Republican obstructionism when they're trying to make that legislation happen?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be much legislation over the next 2 years that appeals to either side. I would also suggest that the characterization of Democratic initiative and Republican obstructionism might be reversed also, since the Republicans control the Senate and the White House. It might be the other way around. It might be that the Republicans try to initiate things that more fit the conservative agenda and the Democrats obstruct it in the House. But either way, I don't think you're looking at too much progress over the next 2 years. And that might not be a bad thing.
So what's left for them to do?
What's left for them to do?
Investigations.
Talk. There's a lot of talk that's going to happen. A lot of investigation in the House, a lot of attempts to grandstand, to pass legislation through one House that won't have any chance in the other House.
I think the opportunity to do that, though, and to put some generate legislation, at least from the Democratic side in the House, is an opportunity to show the country what direction the party wants to move. Right now, the majority of issues that that Democrats have rallied around in 2018 are kind of looking backward and dragging those issues with. Well, what's our vision for the country? What's our vision for the party, and how do we illustrate that through a legislative agenda? I think this is the opportunity to lay that foundation, even if they don't become law.
I think it's interesting, to your point, is I go back to, I think, infrastructure would be something. But Ed Rendell, former governor of Pennsylvania, actually, I think it was on election night, said to his party, seeing the writing on the wall that they were in control of the House, I was going to quote him here, he said to his party, he said, we need to legislate, and please forget about trying to investigate, if anyone else caught that. So I think hopefully they catch on to that they hang their hat on that. Maybe I do think there's a little bit of room for some kind of bipartisan there. The rest of it, largely the roadblocks. The other thing I think we'll see is the grandstanding of those who maybe are looking to make a presidential run in the next year. They might try and make a name for themselves, trying to come out. There's no real big candidates that jump out at me that would scare me as a Republican, I think, that would take down President Trump and what he's built up. I don't know. I think it'd be interesting to see maybe Beto O'Rourke. They've been talking about him, keep going, but I don't know. The guy can fundraise.
Do you think the hearing with Brett Kavanaugh and his appointment had anything to do with how voter turnout happened this election?
I saw some survey. I don't think so. I saw something on that, but I don't remember what it was.
The bump off of that, the boost for either side was relatively quick and faded well ahead of the election. So I don't think that was a defining issue in this particular
I think that's
cycle.
the kind of thing people mention among other things, but I don't think that changed anybody's mind one way or the other.
Yeah, I don't think it was a big overall push, but I do think what is interesting is the U.S. Senate races in which the senators who voted against him or for him, how they turned out, and really almost down the line, every U.S. senator that voted against Kavanaugh ended up losing their seat, with the exception of Joe Manchin out of West Virginia. Interesting to note, though, why he did it. I mean, Joe Manchin's a Democrat U.S. senator, but Trump won West Virginia by 47 points. That should be a stronghold, as Dr. Ward said. But it's also interesting that number's so high because one Hillary Clinton made it a little too obvious that she was kind of anti-coal in probably coal capital of the country. Didn't go over so well. So that's why that number is so skewed that way. And then he went on and voted for Joe Manchin, the Democrat, the only Democrat that voted for Kavanaugh, ended up winning his election. So I think, to your point, to a small degree, Kavanaugh did have some influence in at least who stayed on, who didn't stay on. I also think it's interesting, just minding Manchin, if he flips his party affiliation. There's been some rumors that he might switch to Republican, and there's precedent where the current governor of West Virginia, who ran as a Democrat, got it 6 months after he was elected in 2016, 6 months after in 2017, he switched his registration to Republican, and he's not really seeing much opposition to it. So it could happen where Manchin becomes a Republican and increases the Republican majority in the Senate. That'd be fun.
It happened. See, I would think, though, that some women did vote on the Kavanaugh issue. I didn't see a darn thing in research for today, but I would think so. And then it's what Jeffery was saying about the senators who voted against Kavanaugh and lost their seats. McCaskill in Missouri and Donnelly in Indiana and Heitkamp in North Dakota, so they all lost their seats, and for other reasons too.
Those
but,
are tough seats for Democrats no matter what, so.
Rough territory,
Yeah.
Incumbents, though, all the same.
True.
There has been some Republicans saying that a Republican should run against President Trump for the 2020 election. I just want to get your thoughts on that, and if anyone were to run against him, who do you think it should be?
Well, I think it's interesting. I always think it's good for democracy for more engagement. I think it's good checks and balances on things like that. Who I think it should be, I don't know. Who I think it might be, I bet Jeff Flake might throw his name out there, the senator from Arizona.
What about Ben Sass?
Ben Sass, yeah.
He's another one that could be. I don't know if there's someone I would like, oh yeah, that guy, but it's possible. It might happen.
Kasich didn't do so well in 2016, although
But
a lot of
he's-
Democrats would have
he was another
probably
name.
voted for him if he had won the nomination, so, you know.
It's a very difficult thing to challenge an incumbent president for the nomination. Who's done it recently? I can't think of an example. I mean, I know challengers, but I can't think of anybody who's done it successfully. And when Ted Kennedy tried to do it, he lost against Jimmy Carter. When Theodore Roosevelt tried to do it, he actually split the Republican Party and gave the election to the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. So it's not likely that that would happen. I want to make a point about 2020, about Democrats fielding a candidate. Some of my students have heard me say this, but one thing that liberals don't understand is that the things that they hate about Donald Trump and that motivate them to get out and vote against Donald Trump are the very things that Trump supporters like about him. That he's tough, that he doesn't take any crap from anybody, that he's in your face, that he says what he wants, he's not a politician, he doesn't care about his language, he says what he thinks, he paints with a broad brush and you people fill in the details. Those are the things that his supporters like about him and that motivate them to go out and support him. Those are the very things that really upset liberals, and they just don't understand that's what they like. So when the Democrats think about nominating somebody to oppose Trump in 2020, and that person gets out there and says, look at Trump, he's a jerk, you know, he's this and that, that's just going to motivate the Republicans even more to support him. At least not all Republicans. I think I would guess there must be 40 or 50% of the Republican electorate who would rather have somebody else than Donald Trump. They don't like Trump. When you look at the primary elections, Trump never got more than, 32, 33% of the vote when there were other candidates involved? But as a choice between Donald Trump, who's going to support the Republican agenda, and a Democrat, they'll support Trump every time. And his hardcore base of supporters love his personality, the very things that you people hate.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Show of hands. All right, I guess I struggle to say real quick, but if we'd like to make one real quick final statement before we wrap things up, we can just go down the line if you'd like to add anything. One more call. I think I might have saw a hand go up. Yeah, we have one more question from over there. Just one second.
So with the, obviously we know bitterness. If I eat the poison, I'm trying to poison someone and I'm trying to get them to eat it, but it's really just me eating it. I think about that as like the Democratic Party right now. Instead of them trying to run on platforms that are actually going to be reform-based, they're running on let's hate Trump right now, and it's like you guys are losing a lot of power by doing that. And it's like you could just instead be thinking about things that you're trying to do. So anyway, as far as 2020 though, I mean, we're looking for spitballing. Who do you think is going to run in the Democratic Party? I mean, like, just anybody. I mean, and I would love to see Ryan, and I think that if Trump loses and whoever wins the Democratic Party, if it's Sanders or if it's Clinton, hope not, I would love to see Biden, because he's a very intelligent gentleman, but
He's too
can
old.
you guys just like give me a couple ideas on who I'm gonna study for the next couple of years? as
so
far as
Sherrod
Democratic
Brown?
Party presidential candidates?
I'll kick us off because I want to answer the
Kirsten
first part of your
Gilliland.
question and address something that's been said a couple of times, that the Democrats were just running against Trump. I mean, that was kind of, that was the I think the larger public narrative was, oh, everybody's reacting against Trump, everybody's reacting against Trump. But you didn't hear a lot of Democratic candidates out there stumping against Trump. They were talking about themselves and making a point to say Donald Trump is not on this ballot. Now, they courted a lot of voters by saying, you may be unhappy with Donald Trump, but let's talk about something that's going to matter to you at the end of the day. And I think I think that message kind of gets lost. Now, when we translate that into who's going to run in 2020, I think there are some stalwart Democrats who are hoping that Joe Biden might be that guy. And Dr. Gentleman, you say he's too old, but he's the same age that Reagan was when he
No, Biden's old.
one last
Like
time. maybe by a year or two, but he's in the wheelhouse. But I don't think that Joe Biden ultimately at the end of the day wants to. I think he could probably be pushed into it, but I don't think that Joe Biden wants to. I think the right Democratic candidate is going to be somebody who talks like Joe Biden, and
that's a good point.
who talks like Joe Biden and is able to both be statesmanly and compete with Donald Trump in a debate on that kind of schoolyard level that Trump likes to navigate through. So it's going to be a unique candidate. It's going to have to be somebody with charisma. Earlier you mentioned Beto O'Rourke. I think there's a lot of excitement around Beto O'Rourke right now, but I see Beto O'Rourke being a really strong contender for the keynote address at the convention in 2020.
Obama did.
And then seeing how his fundraising builds. I think running the joke now is running off of a loss for Senate isn't that great of an idea. Lincoln's the last person to lose a Senate race and win the presidency. So I do think I think Lincoln would be a Democrat right now, by the way. No, I think that Tim Ryan is growing in popularity. I think America is kind of waking up to Tim Ryan, and that's an important thing. But that also,
You think Tim Ryan for president?
I think Tim Ryan could be a sleeper in that, and we'll see what happens through the battle for party leadership. But I do think that he could be a sleeper there, particularly in the Midwest. Somebody who speaks somewhat conservatively, but still knows how to talk to the Democratic base of unions and working class families. So it really is up in the air, and we'll see how this plays out a lot. And let's not forget too that and for all you voters out there, we've got a really important 2019 with local elections that are going to have local judges and county-wide races, county council and city council, and these races are going to have a really important impact on kind of your daily life and the things that happen in your community, and ultimately the outcomes of those races in 2019 could have an impact on the kinds of candidates that develop momentum in 2020.
Well, these are the names I'd heard recently. Sherrod Brown just won his Senate reelection in Ohio. So John Hickenlooper is leaving the governorship in Colorado. And, well, you know what, Kirsten Gillibrand, she's a senator from New York State. And I thought I had a fourth. I'm blanking on the California senator Kamala Harris, who had some things to say during the Kavanaugh hearings. And then, Cory Booker had a few things to say too. So those names are out there at least.
My initial thought before the Kavanaugh hearings was actually someone as a Republican I thought Cory Booker was senator from New Jersey, more because I think he could not be beaten down by maybe the bully tactics that Trump kind of tends to use. I think he could go punch for punch a little bit. And, maybe he appeal to a certain demographic, motivate different things, but he's from New Jersey. And I don't think that's going to play as well. I think where we should look where they might come from, and I don't know who that person is, I think whoever the next candidate is needs to spend time in 6 races, 3 Rust Belt, 3 Sun Belt, and that's going to be Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and was it Michigan, I think? Yeah, Michigan. Those are going to be the top 3. You have to win those. And the Sun Belt's going to be Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona. So it'd be interesting to see if a Democrat contender comes from one of those 6 states is going to go a long way, help lock up at least one of those states. It really would be interesting. So I think it behooves the Democratic Party to court someone from one of those 6. Don't know what that looks like yet. But if you're going to win the presidential, you're going to have to win those 6.
Okay, I think we have one more question, then we'll go to the closing statements.
This could be a quick question. In terms of becoming more politically informed in an unbiased way, considering that there are people sitting there that have to stand in front of a classroom of people that you don't know what political party you're talking to, what sources would you recommend for someone who doesn't have cable, such as podcasts or people that just generally speak on unbiased terms?
I can only think of biased things.
Yeah, me
so,
too.
Unfortunately. Well, you know what? This very library used to get National Journal, and now, of course, not. But if you give me your email, I could find them. CQ Weekly Report. Also, the library used to get no money anymore, but it might be online. But those were unbiased. I used them in graduate school, and they're readable. And as far as I know, they might be the only ones that are left over that are unbiased.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second. If you email me at jdfisher@edinboro.edu, I'll send you a handout that gives you 5 relatively unbiased news sources you can consult every single day, all free and on the internet. JD Fisher.
And I would also say there's nothing wrong with consulting traditional media that may appear biased as long as you look at all different ones. I mean, I read the New York Times and Wall Street Journal every day, and they are on opposite sides. And then I make my own mind. Trust your own judgment to
Develop
decide.
your media literacy.
Right, exactly.
Any question?
I don't need the mic. So, like, you guys threw out a lot of, like, politicians' names for, like, who's going to be running in 2020. But you also talked about how people like that Trump wasn't a politician and that he was outspoken. Do you think we're going to see more outspoken politicians or more non-politicians?
I think the question for those viewing at home, do you think we're going to see more outspoken politicians, or what was the second part?
Or more non-politicians?
More non-politicians.
I think we're going to retreat away from the non-politicians for a little while. It's just my instinct. I mean, people like seeing them around, and certainly the celebrity helps going into a race like this. Donald Trump was already 15 points ahead of people going into debates because the audience knew who he was. But I don't know that I don't know that that's going to continue to translate. I don't know that we see a Rock for president or something, or Oprah even for president. I don't know that trend continues, because I don't think it's something that either party necessarily wants to embrace and didn't embrace in 2016 for the most part. It just happened to be the way that it shook out.
Do we have any last comments on that question, or can we go to the final comments from our panelists? We want to thank everyone for coming tonight, for attending our panel. We're going to close off with a couple last statements, and that'll conclude our event.
Well, I encourage you to look at least at some either publications, podcasts, whatever they're called, to see if you think that there was a blue wave, because I've seen all kinds of different things about that. If nothing else, it's an historical election, because so many women won in Congress, and a lot of diverse people won, at least in the U.S. House, Muslims, Native Americans, and so forth, and that's really different. It's possible that the Democrats could work with the Republicans in Congress. I read some things that reminded us of the Reagan years and tax cuts and immigration reform, so it's possible, but the climate is different today. I think it's too polarized. And probably should say some more things, but at any rate, those are some things I had to say.
Well, I think I got most of my thoughts out. My wife probably won't believe that. But in closing, I just think it's interesting to see how it'll play out. As a lover of political news and stuff, I'm interested to see in the coming weeks. I anticipate a nice break from the national stage, hopefully, and like Dr. Wirtz said, is get involved locally. If you're not your local party, there's a lot of judge races coming up, pretty apolitical. A lot of those people work both sides of the fence on those. It's a good taste to get involved in some of your local politics, get a feel for it, take it back home to wherever you might live. I think it's interesting too is this, what the gentleman over there asked about is, kind of the shift in thing is kind of this resist movement is Democrats really need to come up with some kind of policy platform as well that they can go to that's more than just a broad-based health care, and then we've heard health care for years. We had the Affordable Care Act and everything else. It needs to be more specific. I think Republicans moving down the line needs to become increasingly more efficient at communicating their wins. The quote Trump said, "Oh, you're going to win, you're tired of winning." But a lot of times he does things, to what Dr. Gentleman was saying, that motivates the Republican base, and he'll do something that attacks like, "Wow, we are so excited of this win." You may not like the way he does it, you don't agree with it, you can't understand it. I don't understand it either. But this thing is, I'm surprised that people are surprised that he's doing the very things he said he was set out to do in a very unorthodox way, but he's doing them all the same. Things like that I think should be noted that is completely lost on this midterm was things like Korea. I mean, Dr. Gentleman can probably speak about things with the Korean relationships to a lot more authority than I can. But if you just look at how previous presidents have been able to interact with them and the successes that Donald Trump has had in just having a meeting, for crying out loud, let alone having some small bit of measurement to getting him to concede on some things, whether you agree he's following through on that or not, the very fact that they're having that conversation, that U.S. soldiers remain to be coming home, that there's some policy, some dialogue there has never happened before. Very weeks before that happened, there was calls for, oh my gosh, we go on nuclear war, and now they're upset that progress isn't happening quick enough. So why are those things forgotten? The Republican Party needs to remind people, hey, this happened. We have such a short attention span. That's probably the bit of it. I'd be really interested to see what happens in the future. Thanks for your time, guys. If you want to look more about me, check me out on Twitter. I'm also a writer in magazine, Business Magazine. I get published once a month. I contribute elsewhere too if you want to hear more about my thoughts. So, thanks, guys.
I think that there are some things to be hopeful about, and one of them is the potential for folks to work across the aisle. I think for a long time, particularly since 2008, Republicans and Democrats have been playing two different games in Congress, and Republicans have taken a much stronger tactic in trying to drive home their agenda, and ensure that all of the policy and all of the rules that are made are in line with that agenda, and it's been highly effective for them to some extent. Democrats are playing a much more traditional game. Oh, those are the rules we're going to play with inside the lines, and I don't know that it served them as well. I think you'll see some correction to that, and some correction to at least the rules within the House of Representatives, and we'll see how that plays out between Democrats and Republicans. For all of the diversity and all of the change that has come to the House of Representatives in 2018, I think it's important to remember, too, that it still is a majority of elderly white men that are in charge in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate, and so many of them were there when folks worked across the line and when this country had a much more bipartisan kind of country first agenda, and so I think we can get back there, but it's going to take moving some of the conversations that happen on the basketball court and the baseball field back onto the floor in the House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate. So, and I would say again that next year is much more important. Vote local early and often, and make sure that you make sure that you know what's happening at the local level, because because we have a college audience, I'll quote Hunter Thompson and say, you'll never care more. you'll never care more about who was elected sheriff or judge than if you run afoul of the law. And so these are our elections that play a very important part in your community and in the development of your families and your homes. And so you need to get out and work for them and encourage your friends to vote. We told everybody this year to take a friend or two to the polls with you. You need to make sure that you're connected, and you do that as well again next year. Because going from 54% back to 22% that we saw in the mayoral primary is unacceptable. And I think that is a bipartisan issue we can agree on. So.
Yeah, I'm not running, so I don't care if you vote or not. And that's particularly true for people who don't know anything. I would encourage you to take American politics first, Poly 101. I would encourage you to learn something and then decide if you want to vote. I think it's kind of trouble when people who don't know anything go to the polls simply because everybody else told them to vote, and then they don't know who to vote for. They just vote because someone tells them who to vote for. So increase your knowledge first. But what I really want to say is I think that the Democrats are in danger of investigate. And I think the Republicans, who are very good at labeling things, will call that the politics of harassment and use that against them in the years ahead, in a couple of years ahead. So I think that the Democrats have a very strong card to play with investigations, but they have to be very careful how to do it, and that's what I'll be watching over the next couple of years. Thank you for coming.
All right, can we have one more round of applause for our panel? Thank you, everyone, for coming. Vote.
Forgot all about that presidential harassment that McConnell came up with the other.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, well, anyway.
If you're here for extra credit, come sign in.